Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. What is the M2C Citation Cartel? Jonathan Neville is going to tell us he has an issue with a certain group of researchers who only want to promote the Mesoamerican geography theory of the Book of Mormon. So we'll find out that Jonathan is peer-reviewing their work. Check out our conversation.
But the gist of it was that I thought, okay, getting back to your question about Rod, I satisfied myself anyway.
Yeah, see, that's where I'm really curious is what did Rod say that convinced you, hey, Heartland's the way to go?
Well, I think it was a combination of things. Partly it was a seed planted by Wayne's presentation earlier. Wayne May, where he had shown all these artifacts from, Native Americans in the Midwestern United States that I didn't even know existed. I didn't even know there were mounds, really. And so that kind of planted a seed, and I thought, well, that's interesting, but, I had known the M2C scholars for decades. For example, Jack Welch, his first year at the law school was my last year at the law school. And I remember I wanted to meet him. We talked about Hugh Nibley and how the ideals of Zion relate to practicing law, and because there was a group of us that were kind of idealistic, and we didn't want to get into the money thing and all of this. And he said, well, you really have to separate the two worlds, because Nibley was an idealist, but we also live in the real world, and we have to practice law and make money and build Zion that way, kind of a thing.
You were going to be an ACLU attorney or something?
No, not necessarily, but at the time I didn't know. I ended up clerking for the Supreme Court down in New Mexico when I got out of law school. And so I got to know a lot of lawyers. I didn't really know anything about the law when I went to law school. I only went to law school kind of to check it off. Like one of my sons says, in business, almost everybody has to be a lawyer just to get by, And plus I was interested in it, but I had never really known lawyers or what they did.
So your goal was to be more of a businessman?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because I got my master's in agribusiness while I was in law school as a joint degree. So I was much more interested in my business classes than I was in the law classes.
Oh, wow.
But I got this clerkship at the Supreme Court in New Mexico, and in that process I really learned what law was about and how you practice law and how lawyers work. That was really the first time, Actually, during law school I did some summer work for lawyers, so I learned the nuts and bolts of practicing law. But it wasn't until I did that clerkship that I really understood how arguments can be so narrow, and one little point can make all the difference and all this between a decision the Supreme Court makes, And sometimes the decisions were divided. And you could understand how both arguments, both the majority and the dissent, had really good, solid arguments. And it's almost flipping a coin to decide between them, And that's what happens at the U.S. Supreme Court, too, all the time. Most of the decisions are unanimous or large majorities, but the real close cases is just one vote making a difference.
Right.
It affects the whole country. And you can rationally understand how both sides make sense. They both have sound precedent, and everything else is just basically a policy decision. And so I took that kind of a background in understanding how people can have completely different opinions, but they're both rational based on fact. And I looked at the Book of Mormon geography thing from that perspective. And so when I went with Rod, and I spent a lot of time with him on the bus, asking him questions and looking at the mounds, and we went to the museums, and I saw these things, and it was, to me, it looked exactly like what the Book of Mormon described. Because, I'd been to Central America. The Book of Mormon doesn't say anything about big stone pyramids or jungles or any of that kind of stuff. So there's already, I had the little incongruities that critics have pointed out for almost 200 years, that it doesn't even describe any jungles or Central American stuff, no Mayan stuff. But where is it then, if it's not Central America, right? So when I did this research on the Times and Seasons with the authorship of these articles, I said, well, those articles are dubious at best. We know they're anachronistic anyway. And to attribute them to Joseph Smith was what I call a major mistake in church history. Never should have happened. And so once you remove those articles and you look at just the text of the Book of Mormon and what we know Joseph Smith did say, about Hill Cumorah and about the mounds in on Zion's camp. He wrote about they traveled over the mountains of Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, and he said that was evidence of the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon. That was a letter he wrote to Emma. And a few other things, that the Zelf incident and so on.
Well, let me ask you a question there. This goes a little bit into Sorensen too, because it seems to me, and I'm pretty sure Sorensen argues this, Joseph Smith really had kind of a hemispheric view where, the narrow neck of land is Central America, Guatemala, or whatever, and then the land southward would South America would be Lamanites, and then land northward would be Nephites, and so it was all of North and South America.
Yeah,
and so Joseph pretty much embraced any Native American artifact, whether it was in Chile or Central America or Ohio. I mean, isn't that
no?
You disagree with that?
I disagree with that, and the reason is the only specific things. Now, the Pratt brothers and Winchester were talking about the hemispheric model. No doubt.
The Pratt brothers.
Yeah, Orson and Parley talked about it, and Winchester talked about it.
Okay.
And one of the key things that, again, I don't know if anybody had written about this, but when I saw it, it was real obvious. When Joseph Smith wrote the Wentworth letter, this was in March of 1842, he copied Orson Pratt's pamphlet that Orson Pratt had written in 1840. And it was called an account of visions. I can't remember the title of it. Haven't really thought about this for a while, but it came to my mind when you brought this up. Because in that, he talked about Joseph's experiences, spiritual experiences, and he talked about the Book of Mormon. And he spent 3 or 4 pages talking about the Native Americans, which they didn't call Native Americans, but let's say the Indians, in Central America. And when Joseph Smith had been tracking it, you can see this in the Joseph Smith papers, he'd been tracking Orson Pratt real close until he got to that point. And that's when he made the statement, the remnant, he'd been talking about Lehi's people, the remnant are the Indians that live in this country. It was a direct contradiction to what Orson Pratt had said about Central and South America. And it's real obvious. I did a side-by-side column so everybody could see that he was tracking them all the way along until he got to that point. And when you see it that way, you can see that he was rejecting what Orson Pratt had said, specifically rejecting it. And that's why when he said, the remnant are the Indians that live in this country, that's a very important statement. And, I've seen the M2C scholars argue about what he meant by this country. Well, this country could be the whole hemisphere, is what they argue, basically.
It's funny to me that you call it M2C, because I've had a Baja guy on, I've had Malay. Everybody believes in it that doesn't, except for Heartlanders.
Yeah.
Anybody who has any sort of other theory believes there are 2 Comoras.
Right.
And so it's funny to me that you're referring to M2C as Meso only.
That's right.
That applies to pretty much everybody else.
And that's a really good point, and I've addressed that a few times, but I'll explain why I did this. And that's because I know those guys that did the Baja thing. They're awesome. All the Malay. In fact, I've been in Malaysia, and Thailand and Cambodia. Actually, of all the places I visited in the world, the one that aligns best with the Book of Mormon is Cambodia, in terms of the artifacts and the icons and stuff, because they have the elephants, they have the chariots, the horses, they have everything.
I know, they really do.
And so, and Sorensen has a book about the transoceanic migrations and so on. A lot of people think the Mayans came from Cambodia or Southeast Asia because of the similar architecture, and that's a whole nother thread to go down. Mm-hmm. And so I appreciate that. And I've always made the point that there's really only 2 approaches to the Book of Mormon. Either the Hills Cumorah is in New York, or it's not. If it's not, it could be anywhere, right? Right. Literally anywhere in the world. I can make an argument for Russia, It's
I've not heard that one before.
Well, it's easy. It's easy, believe me, because when all you have is a land northward, a land southward, and we'll talk about the narrow neck of land, which could be all kinds of things. You really... If the Hill Cumorah is not in New York, it could be anywhere in the world. Right. And the thing that struck me as being kind of surprising too is, why are we even looking in the Americas? The only reason we look in the Americas is because of what Joseph and Oliver said about it. But they were the same ones who said Cumorah's in New York. So there's nothing in the text that talks about the Americas or the Western Hemisphere. So all these guys that say, well, we're doing an internal map, we're only focusing on what the text says, they shouldn't even be looking in the Americas. Or they could, but they could be looking in the whole world. That's why, to me, the Malay thing is just as plausible as the Mesoamerica once you reject the Hill Cumorah in New York. The reason I use M2C is because there's what I call, I talk about the citation cartel, right? The M2C Citation Cartel, but it's, the Baja guys are doing their thing.
What do you mean by the citation cartel?
I'll explain that.
Okay.
There's the dominant LDS scholarly publications today are BYU Studies and the Interpreter, probably.
Maxwell Institute.
Yeah, Maxwell Institute, but they don't get into
They don't really
this.
get into geography.
Yeah. And I've talked with those guys, and they don't want to.
They don't even want to tackle it.
They don't want to have. They don't want to take any sides. They want to take a position, and so, which is good. But their predecessor was Farms,
Right.
which those your listeners may or may not know how Farms became part of the Maxwell Institute, and then basically Farms became Book of Mormon Central, kind of diverged. And the guys at Book of Mormon Central are the ones who started Farms, and they took their logo back and all this. So Book of Mormon Central is the intellectual descendant of Farms, even though it may not.
Not the Interpreter? See, I always thought it was the Interpreter.
No, that was Dan Peterson.
Yeah.
Dan Peterson later came into Farms, and he got kicked out of Farms, and he took his followers and started his own deal called the Interpreter.
Right.
But he wasn't involved originally at Farms.
Okay.
It was Jack Welch and John Sorensen, and I think Kirk Magleby. And those are the guys at Book of Mormon Central.
Okay.
So that's why it's a little bit of a complex descendancy. Or you have the organization and you have the intellectual.
I mean, you could probably argue that Book of Mormon Central and Interpreter are children of Farms. Would that be a good
you can
way
do
to say
that,
it?
sure. I call them a Potemkin village because they have these storefronts. You have Book of Mormon Central, Fair LDS, Interpreter, Meridian Magazine, and they all look like different entities, but it's all one village. It's all the same interlocking people.
Okay.
And that's the M2C Citation Cartel. Because I call them the M2C because of the Mesoamerican two Cumorahs, but none of those guys go with the Baja guys or the Thailand or Malaysia. It's all, or even the Peru or Panama guys.
Yeah.
Those guys are not part of the M2C Citation Cartel. And if you want to publish something in the Interpreter or BYU Studies or Book of Mormon Central, it has to at least be consistent with M2C, the Mesoamerican two Cumorahs theory.
Okay.
And I'll give you an example of that. Because I have to emphasize this because I really feel this way. I love those guys. I think I like every one of them that I've ever met. And I respect their scholarship. I appreciate what they do. And I think in terms of facts, I really like what they've come up with in doing historical research or archaeology, whatever. It's the conclusions that they derive from those facts that I don't agree with. And so, for example, Book of Mormon Central, I did a book. I don't remember if it was my first book after the Nauvoo trilogy, but I did a book called Letter 7. And that's because when Oliver Cowdery wrote these 8 historical essays, in essay number 7, his 8 essays were published as letters in the Messenger and Advocate, 1834 and 5. In letter number 7, he talked about the Hill Cumorah. And in that letter, he said it was a fact that these final battles took place in that mile-wide valley west of Cumorah. And he described it in some detail. And when I saw that, I thought, well, what the heck, why are we even discussing this? Here, Oliver Cowdery, and at the time, he was the assistant president of the church. And he said in there that Joseph had helped him write these letters. And when he was set apart as the assistant president of the church, Joseph Smith ordained him to that position. And one of his charges was to kind of be the voice or the speaker, or whatever it is, to represent the church. And he gave the commission to the Quorum of the 12 when they were set apart and so on. That famous charge he gave to the 12 that you can read about. Well, when he wrote this letter 7, he had all the authority of the assistant president of the church representing the first presidency to write that. And not only did he just write it, but Joseph had his scribes copied into his own personal history as part of his life story. And then Joseph gave permission to Benjamin Winchester to publish it. He gave these essays to his brother Don Carlos to republish them in the Times and Seasons, and his brother William Smith republished them again in The Prophet in New York. So I looked at that and I thought, I don't see how it could be any more authoritative, right, than all that endorsement, unless Joseph Smith had said at some meeting, maybe in the King Follett sermon, had said something like, I'm going to tell you once again, after all these other times, Cumorah's in New York, Maybe that's what they expect. But he did refer to it in D&C 128, that letter he wrote in the Times and Seasons in September of 1842, when he talked about glad tidings from Cumorah. And what people don't realize is everyone who read that had just read Letter 7 the year before in the same newspaper. So everybody knew Cumorah was in New York. And so once I saw all this, and I thought, this Letter 7 is hugely important. And it's been omitted. It's been basically decorrelated from everything. You can't find it in any publications. And I thought, well, I'm going to do a little book on it. So I did this little book, Letter 7, and all it was the history of the publication of that book. I didn't talk about geography other than what he said about the Hill Cumorah. So this was early on when Book of Mormon Central was first organized. And I went to him and said, you guys want to have all the information about the Book of Mormon in one place, right? And they said, yeah. So I said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you the right to republish my book, Letter 7, put the whole book on your webpage for free. Anybody can have it. And they said, great. So they did. And they had it on there for about a year or maybe 2 years, something like that. And then they took it off. They removed it. And I thought, well, okay, so you're removing it. Why exactly? There's nothing in there that you can't find in the Joseph Smith papers. There's nothing, I didn't make anything up, or I didn't add my own theories. I was just reporting, here's church history. And yet they took it down. And now if you go to the Book of Mormon Central webpage, the only thing they have about Letter 7 is it's hard for me to say with a straight face, but what they call no-wise. I don't know if you're familiar with that. They have these series of articles that they call KNO-WHY, so no-why.
Yeah.
And I kind of use that same word, but I call it NO-WISE, no-wise, because they write these things, and some of them are, frankly, kind of ludicrous. And they're so blatantly relying on sophistry to persuade people about Mesoamerica. It's stunning to me that they even do it. But the one on Letter 7 they have on there is of this nature, where they're trying to tell people, well, Oliver Cowdery was just speculating. This idea of Cumorah started as a rumor, and it was a false tradition that Joseph Smith later embraced, all this kind of stuff. That's why I call them the M2C Citation Cartel.
Okay.
And this last issue of BYU Studies had an article about Book of Mormon geography that was pretty fantastic, because for the first time that I know of, they discussed the Mesoamerican stuff along with the Heartland stuff. And they mentioned the letter to Emma. I mean, the guy, I won't mention who wrote it, because he's an awesome guy. I've talked to him before too, and I really like him. But you can tell that he has his, either he or the editor has their thumb a little bit on the Mesoamerica because of the way it was approached. But at least for the first time, they acknowledged the Heartland as an option. And I think that will help to open the eyes of members of the church everywhere that read BYU Studies. Because for
Can you tell us the name of the article?
Yeah, I think it's just called Book of Mormon Geography.
Okay.
I have a link. I have a webpage. Well, I don't have it, but there's an organization called Museum of the Book of Mormon, mobom.org, and I contributed my analysis of their geography on that. You could put it in the show links or something. But I contributed my analysis of their article. But I had to acknowledge this is an awesome breakthrough, because for the first time, members of the church can see that this Mesoamerican thing is not a catechism that you have to believe. There's alternative ways to approach this. And I was really excited to see that. I'm hoping, I keep working to the extent I can with Book of Mormon Central and Fair Latter-day Saints and even the Interpreter to get them to acknowledge that there's alternatives to Mesoamerica that make just as much sense, but they're also consistent with the teachings of the prophets, which is awesome, So anyway, that's a long answer to your question why I call it M2C, but it's those organizations and magazines enforce the Mesoamerican to Cumorah's theory. And the guys at Baja or Panama, wherever, Malaysia, they just have their theory out there, and they're cool. People can believe whatever they want. That's not how it is with the Meso guys. And I've talked to people. I won't mention anybody's names, but I've talked to people who have observed that the Mesoamerican guys get visceral about this. They get really upset with the idea of the Heartland, and I don't think it's because they feel like it's too ridiculous. I think they're threatened by it. And I think it's a psychological thing, really, because when I think of having, because I used to teach Mesoamerica for a long time. On my mission in France, I bought a book about the Mayans, and I would take that with me when I'd go teach people, stuff like that. So I've been teaching this for decades. And if I had been teaching it at BYU for decades and then realized I was wrong, it would be very difficult to acknowledge that. So what I hope they would do, and I've been asking them to do, is I'm saying, look, you don't have to change your mind about anything. Keep believing in your Mesoamerican stuff all you want. But how about acknowledging that there's faithful members of the church who don't accept the Mesoamerican thing, but they do accept the Heartland, and here's the reasons. Let's just have a comparison chart. Here's the reasons why people believe in Meso, here's why they believe in Heartland, and if you want to add the others, that's fine. But those, in terms of popularity, you could say, or even in terms of scriptural and prophetic and extrinsic evidence support, it's really either Mesoamerica or Heartland. And so they won't do it so far. They refuse to do any kind of comparison. And I think they know that when people see the actual comparison, more and more members of the church are saying, well, the Heartland makes more sense. And I don't know if you were planning to get into this, but I can tell you another reason why they resist the Heartland, but maybe we could talk about that later on.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jonathan Neville. In our next conversation, Jonathan's going to talk about the possibility that Lehi stopped in Australia.
And he said, so do you know Lehi landed here on his way to America?
In Australia?
In Australia.
I had not heard that one.
And I said, I didn't know that one. And he goes, it's right here in chapter, it's an I can't remember which chapter, but it talks about Godanya as one of the military leaders. Godanya is the Australian term, good on you.
Oh, okay.
So that was his little joke.
Okay.
But I think he was serious too, So then I said, well, have you heard about the Heartland?
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents for just $5 a month. Patreon is spelled patreon.com/gospeltangents. If you'd like to watch the entire video, you can subscribe at YouTube, Patreon, or on my website at gospeltangents.com and click the yellow subscribe button for just $8 a month. PDF transcripts are just $10 a month, and you can get those on patreon.com/gospeltangents or on my website. I'll send those to you as soon as I've finished completing it. If you'd like to get a paperback and PDF, just subscribe for $20 a month at either Patreon or on my website. Individual paperbacks are available at Amazon.com. Just do a search for Gospel Tangents Interview, and you can find all of our past interviews there. Show your Gospel Tangents pride by purchasing a t-shirt on our website at gospeltangents.com/shop. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. You can get our latest updates by friending me at Facebook, or you can also follow our page at facebook.com/gospeltangents. Become an insider and you can see the newest videos. Follow us on Twitter at Gospel Tangents. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.